Welcome everybody to the last broadcast of the CWA media of this year, 2020. This has been a very difficult year in some sense for working class for various reasons, the health crisis, economic crisis, and various difficulties we have faced. And the socialistworld.net carried a number of analyses in this whole year. However, today we got two international secretariat from CWI, Tony Snow and Hannah Sell, to kind of summarize the year 2020 and give a bit more of the analysis. First of all, with Hannah, the 2020 have seen this major health crisis with COVID and worsened economic situation in many countries world over. See, this is one of the worst economic crises since 1930s. What does this mean for capitalism and the working class in the 2020?
Thanks, Senan. That's a big question. I suppose the first point is the obvious one, that 2020 has been a nightmare for working class people and the poor around the world, but it's also marked a certain turning point. If you look back before 2020, capitalism had never recovered in real terms, and particularly in terms of workers' living conditions, from the previous crisis in 2007-2008. And then there was already a new crisis developing before the pandemic started. But the pandemic, of course, has enormously deepened and accelerated that crisis. So, as Senan said, this is certainly the deepest crisis since the 1930s. The British Tory Chancellor has said in Britain that it will be the deepest economic crisis for 300 years. And there are many other countries around the world where that's the case. This is the sharpest economic crisis ever in reality. And that's meant misery. Above all, in the neo-colonial world, saw the incredible figure that 100,000 farmers in India have committed suicide as a result of the terrible poverty and misery they're facing, but also in the industrialised countries. In Britain, there are 2 million people who have suffered deprivation as a result of the pandemic this year. That means that they have not been able to feed, to clothe, to house themselves adequately in the course of the year. In the US, it's 50 million. So these are huge figures. Of course, it's not universal misery. There's a section of the capitalist class who have done very nicely indeed out of this. I think, I never know how to say his name, Jeff Bezos. Anyway, the richest man in the world, the CEO of Amazon, his wealth grew by 65% from January to September alone, giving him 186 billion. And it's not just him. Bosses of logistic companies, of pharmaceutical PPE companies. There's a section of the capitalist class who've done very nicely indeed, but capitalism as a whole has gone into a devastating crisis. And as we've discussed in all of these broadcasts, in order to try and limit that, the governments of the richer capitalist countries have bailed out, have pumped money in on an unprecedented scale. So that it now means that debts in Britain, the US, other countries are at a higher level than they've ever been outside of wartime. That's state debt, at the same time as corporate debt was already at a critically high level even before the COVID pandemic, and has got worse as a result. So we're facing a devastating economic situation. Now, of course, if the vaccines are successfully rolled out, that will mean some lessening of the grip of the virus, which will be welcomed. And it will also lead to some economic bounce back. And we want that. The bigger the recovery, the better. But it's ruled out that it is going to undo the damage that's been done in the course of this year. On the contrary, even on the best case scenario, there is going to be serious, what they call permanent scarring. A surge in unemployment, particularly of young and lower skilled workers, sections of industry going to the wall, and the bosses using this crisis to try and drive down the living conditions of and the wages and conditions of those that still have jobs with policies like fire and rehire that they've been trying to do in the course of this year. And while capitalist governments are going to have no choice but to wear, because there's nothing else they can do about it, high levels of debt for a period of time, that isn't going to prevent them using those levels of debt as a reason to further cut public services and public sector workers' wages. We've got a new pay freeze announced in Britain for the public sector. At the same time, as many millions are being handed out to the mates of the Tory government without any tendering even for the contracts to basically put in their back pockets, often literally, they've done literally nothing with it. So what's the overall picture? We will see some recovery from the depths of the crisis, but it will not compensate for what we've suffered. And capitalism generally is in a depressionary era where the recessions are deeper and more prolonged and the periods of growth are shallower and weaker. And what does that mean for the working class? That the only road to defending our jobs and living conditions is by fighting, is by struggle. We're not going to get anything given to us by the capitalist class. Weak capitalist governments can be forced into U-turns. The British government, I think, have carried out 17 U-turns so far this year. I've lost count, it might be more than that by now, but it was 17 a couple of months ago. And that includes, in the face of a few A-level students protesting, being forced to U-turn. So they can be forced to give concessions on the basis of mass struggle. And we will see mass struggle. We already have this year, haven't we? The Lebanon, Hong Kong, Chile, Thailand, Belarus, Nigeria, a whole series of mass struggles. But of course, for them to be fully effective, then they need to be organised. And the other question is, yes, we can force a few concessions, but this crisis-ridden capitalist system is not going to provide working class people with stable and decent living conditions. That requires a different kind of society, a socialist society. And that, the struggle for that is going to be key in the coming decade. But I'm sure we'll say more about that as we continue.
Thanks, Hannah. Hannah, it's more attack on the card for the working class. While they gain still lots of profits, the capitalist class, they still will use the crisis to kind of increase the attacks in the coming years. And then the opposition should be built and so on. But also at the same time, I want to ask Tony, this is also a new era of geopolitical relations emerged in this year with the decline of the US and the rise of China. And what are the main features? And then how these things are likely to develop in the coming decades. Tony, can you explain a little bit about that?
Yes, well, thanks, Sanan. I think we have, the first point I think we have to emphasise here on every aspect of geopolitical relations, and as far as the whole political situation is concerned internationally, 2020 is going to go down and will be marked as the opening of an entirely new era of capitalism. We're in a whole new, unprecedented phase of capitalist crisis, of political crisis, and of course a renewed assault, as you said in your introduction, that we've not seen since the 1930s on the position of the working class. Now, that's being reflected with a fundamental change in world relations, which has been developing for a whole period, but has been greatly accelerated under the course of the COVID crisis. We see, as you correctly said, Senan, the general crisis facing US imperialism, the historic decline which has been developing of US imperialism, which has now, of course, been mirrored by this incredible rise which has taken place by China. Now, that is going to dominate the whole of the world situation for the next decade. How that plays out is not fully clear in terms of how far US imperialism will fall, how far Chinese capitalism and its very special form of state intervention is going to be able to continue to rise, and that's an open question. It's very doubtful whether they're going to be able to continue the unprecedented growth rates that they've had over the course of the last 10 or 15 years in particular. But this clash which is taking place is resulting, I think, in a number of trends. Firstly, we see a very marked opposition of two, or the attempts to be forming of two blocks. One around China, which is they're trying to pull together, as I come on to say in a moment. And now you see a countermeasure being attempted in relation to US imperialism probably spearheaded by Biden. Biden's raised this idea that he's going to call a US summit for democracy. There'll be some very unsavoury and not so democratic forces probably involved in that. But that's an attempt to group around US imperialism an element of a bloc as a counterweight to what China has put together. China, we should remember, because of this phenomenal growth of the markets which has taken place in China and throughout the Pacific region as well. They've recently signed this trade agreement, the RCEP, which is involving 15 countries. It accounts for 30% of the world's population. Now, this is an important development. It includes Australia, New Zealand, Japan, as well as the countries that would more naturally gravitate around China. Now, this illustrates an important point, because the emergence of these blocs, which is taking place, is not going to be a stable phenomenon. And that's particularly illustrated by this bloc that China has put together. It's been signed by all of them. It's got an economic pact. But look at the dilemma that Japanese imperialism faces. On the one side, economically, they're trying to shore themselves up with China. They're very much dependent, particularly on the imports and exports to China, and tourism accounts for a lot of Chinese tourism into Japan as well. So that's on the one side. On the other side, politically and militarily, they're partly threatened by China as well, and are torn, and in that sense more reliant on US imperialism. And those tensions within that bloc are also inevitably going to erupt in the course of the next period. Now, those, you could say, are the two main blocs that have developed, but it's probable, and this is part of a process of the deglobalization of the world economy that we've seen, is going to be a grouping together which is taking place on a very unstable basis. Those may be the main two blocs, but you're seeing other blocs beginning to emerge, which can come into conflict. You've had the strengthening of the Eurasian Economic Union, which is headed by Russia at this stage. I think only a week or two ago, Cuba signed up to it. I mean, there's no sort of logic in terms of what these trading blocs are called and actually which area of the world they incorporate. But nevertheless, it's a measure of where they're going. You now see India, US imperialism, well, if you can call, British imperialism, if you can call it an imperial power now, given its decline and tendency towards breakup, is now, of course, making a drive towards India. And of course, as US is trying to do as well, as a means of trying to coax India into as a counterweight to China at this stage. So we're seeing all of these developments, and it's a reconfiguration of world relations which is taking place, part of the product of the decline of US imperialism. We're not in a unipolar world anymore. That has gone. And we're now into this era of the development of different trading groups and blocs, which are going to be extremely unstable in the period that we're going into. And within that, of course, the conflicts, it can take the form of trade and tariff wars, which has already in relation to the US and China. But in some areas, it can go a lot further. It can result in military conflicts. We see that already beginning to break out. The struggle for spheres of influence, this horrific slaughter which has taken place in Nagorno-Karabakh and the clash between Armenia and Azerbaijan. Again, a product partly of clashes for spheres of influence, the Russian influence there and the Turkish influence there. They're trying to expand their spheres of influence respectively. And it's a very conflicting and uncertain situation. But all of this is there. We have in Asia the continuing conflict in relation to Kashmir. But all of this can be intensified in the course of this very uncertain, unstable world, which is now opening up in the course of the 2020s. And from that point of view, we are in a new era as far as the geopolitical relations are concerned. And it is going to pose the issue of further clashes, tensions, antagonisms, even within the EU. That can erupt into a major conflict in the course of the recent period. We've seen a division, even during the course of this crisis, between Northern Europe, Southern Europe, and Eastern Europe. Tensions emerged, and it wasn't an accident that a couple of weeks ago we saw the Portuguese Prime Minister, who's now assumed the presidency of the European Commission, in response to the expanded EU budget, he's posed it very bluntly, and in effect what he was proposing, that you go for two-tier Europe in EU, which was split into two blocks within the EU fundamentally, a more integrated bloc which fundamentally would be Northern Europe and the rest. And that is a measure of the tensions that are arising there. So we're into a highly conflicted era, and what it's going to pose is a return to national conflicts, national antagonisms. Regions trying to come together to establish spheres of influence, but it's going to pose the crucial necessity that the working class put in an alternative, and what it underlines is, for the working class and for socialists, that alternative needs to be international, because this global conflict and this global crisis cannot be resolved by one nation, by even one region. It requires a globalized solution to be offered by the working class in a struggle that which undoubtedly going to develop in the course of the next decade.
Thanks, Tony. It's very contradictory and very unstable, a complicated era opened up, outlined briefly by Tony there. But also there's another feature that we have seen is the increasing repressive nature of various governments across the world. The dictatorial regime in Sri Lanka, for example, the Modi regime, the onslaught against the farmers and the workers in India. We have seen similar measures being taken across the world, but also we have also seen kind of emergence of far right elements in a number of countries. And Hannah, can you explain a little bit of this and also how serious threat is the far right going to be in the 2020?
Okay, thanks, Sanan. I mean, it's absolutely true that under the guise of COVID, most governments in the world have introduced more repressive legislation. And in the democratic countries, so to speak, then initially a lot of people would have thought, we've got no choice but to go along with this. It's for the public good. It's in order to counter the virus. But of course, the capitalist class are never acting in the interests of the majority and the working class. Always, what it's about is defending the interests of capitalism, and they're racking up laws which they can then use, accumulating laws which they can then use at a later stage against the workers' movement. And you're already seeing that. So, for example, in Britain, to use Britain as an example again, COVID legislation has been used in the last week to try and bully Labour councils who wanted to close the schools a few days earlier in their areas because the rate of infection was so high that COVID was just running rife through the schools. So they've used the legislation that is meant to be there to stop the spread of COVID to force them to keep the schools open and to continue the spread of COVID, which is just a small example of the way this legislation is actually used in every country and in a whole number of countries. Sri Lanka, India is another example. There has been really brutal, violent measures against the working class and poor under the guise of the COVID crisis. And that fact that the capitalist governments are generally becoming more openly repressive, and also the other thing that Sanan referred to about the growth of reaction and far right and right populist tendencies, they're connected, because in the end, they're related to the undermining of the social basis of capitalism, because it can no longer improve the living standards of the majority. And therefore, in order to maintain their rule, they have to rely more on repressive measures, but also of whipping up right-wing, racist, nationalist ideas in order to try and get a social base to maintain their rule. And it's a rule, isn't it? It's a law that you see the development of revolutionary and counter-revolutionary trends together, that you get reaction at the same time as you get radicalisation and workers searching for a better way to run the world, because both reflect the crisis of capitalism. Capitalist parties are increasingly unable to win elections by defending their system. Why would they be able to? Because of what their system is inflicting on the majority. In Britain, Johnson was selected by the Tories. He is not a traditional Tory. He is relying on right-wing Little Englander nationalist ideas but he was selected by them because they thought he could win them an election. It's as simple as that. And you look at the US, big sections of the capitalist class were never happy with Trump. The big majority of the US capitalist class worked to get him out. But nonetheless, in the end, he defended the capitalist system. And they'd rather have him in power, for all they can't control him, than anybody who is acting in the interest, in any sense, of the working class. And on Trump, he's not going to be president anymore. However, the way he got elected, the right populist ideas that he whipped up, those have not been defeated and have not gone away. After all, he got over 74 million votes. And even in the period since the presidential election, he's raised, I think, over $200 million for his campaign against his claim that he was robbed in the election. But really, that's a war chest, partly for his own personal legal campaign maybe, but also to prepare the ground to win political support for a future presidential challenge by him or by somebody else similar. So that's a real danger that exists, what he's been able to whip up in his period in office. Now, having said that, we shouldn't exaggerate. We're not in any country talking about the rise of fascism, the way it rose in the 1930s. This is not the same situation. That was in a situation where there'd been a series of attempts by the working class to transform society, to overturn capitalism and build a new socialist order. They'd been defeated because of the mistakes and betrayals of their leaders. And then you had, desperate to maintain power, the capitalist class in some countries turning towards fascism. We're not in that situation. And the working class is going to have numerous further opportunities to transform society. At this stage, these right populist ideas are primarily electoral. It's governments winning, it's Trump winning elections and so on. They're quite shallow, unstable base for them. And their limits, actually, I'm sure Tony might say something about this further on, have been shown in Latin America, where we've seen just recently mass movements in a whole series of countries that have erupted mainly against right-wing and right populist leaders. General strike in Colombia, Guatemala, the government forced to withdraw austerity packages on the basis of the mass movements, and a whole series of others as well. So there are limits to these moves to the right, but that doesn't mean we underestimate the danger either. After all, you get the far-right Vox Party, for example, having 50 seats in the Spanish parliament, or the social base that Trumpism still has. That is a danger to the working class. Trumpism has given confidence, and he has openly encouraged far-right violent militias that have attacked Black Lives Matter demonstrations and so on, and can try and attack other workers' movement demonstrations, campaigns, strikes, and so on. And what's coming down the road? Biden is going to be a presidency, as he has absolutely already made clear, for the US capitalist class, presiding over unparalleled misery since the 1930s for the working class of the US. The idea that right-wing populist, nationalist, but also falsely claiming we're standing up for the little people against the elites, that all of that cannot continue to develop. Clearly, that danger is there. And in the end, the only effective way to cut across it is by building genuine mass parties of the working class with a socialist programme, which can then start to undercut the electoral base and even the more active minority, in some cases, who are supporting these mistaken nationalist and right-wing ideas.
Thanks, Hannah. Hannah mentioned, despite these problems, we have seen massive workers' movement developing in various countries in Latin America. And like Hannah said, I wanted to bring in Tony here to discuss a little bit more, and what lessons in particularly the international working class should take from the Latin American movement that is erupted this year. Tony?
Well, thanks, Anna, because I think it is important that we do look at the events that have taken place in Latin America, both during the course of this year, last year as well, with the social revolt in Chile, but to put it in a little bit of its broader historical context, because it has a lot of lessons in terms of Europe. Because if we go back you had what was called the pink tide or the pink revolution sweeping the continent. You had the election of Lula in Brazil. You had the from the Workers' Party. We had Morales in Bolivia. We had all the upheavals in Venezuela, the coming to power of Correa in Ecuador as well. There was a whole radicalization took place throughout that period. And the issue that was posed, some were those governments were a bit more radical than others. Chavez went quite a long way in terms of encroaching into capitalism with public ownership, nationalization of some sectors of the economy, and they threatened the interests of capitalism. But not one of them broke from capitalism itself. They all continued within the framework of capitalism. And inevitably, after a period, that led to a period of disillusionment and disappointment and frustration. And then you saw in a whole series of countries the coming to power of right-wing, and in some cases very right-wing governments. For example, in Brazil, we saw the triumph of Bolsonaro, who shot up in the opinion polls and his electoral support towards the end of the campaign. And all of that was based on the disillusionment. And this touches and relates very much to the point that Hannah was commenting upon in relation to what is the real base of the far right and the fascistic elements which do exist. And all of those are present in Latin America. You saw that particularly in Bolivia. They had fascist forces organized militarily in Santa Cruz when they initially tried to overthrow the Morales government in Bolivia. All of that was there. And yet there was a crucial factor that the CWI analysed at the point when these right-wing governments were coming to power. They were coming to power fundamentally as a protest vote of disillusionment with the governments of the so-called left that have been in power, and it did not represent a deep-seated ideological shift to the right amongst the mass of the population. And that was reflected in Latin America in virtually every opinion poll, because the countries that elected right-wing governments in the subsequent opinion polls, when they were asked, do they want more privatization? Do they want more neoliberal policies introduced? All of them were majority. It showed it was not an ideological swing to the right. And therefore, while these governments could appear quite strong, and they were quite brutal in terms of the attacks that they forced through, that was accelerated under the COVID crisis. And then what have we seen? We've seen an incredible position of the entire continent being convulsed with a political crisis and mass movements in a whole series of countries. Bolivia, as disappointment set into the Morales government, they organized last year a de facto coup. Morales fled the country, didn't organize a resistance towards it at all. We've had Bolsonaro, of course, in relation to Brazil. We've had the whole attacks of the Piñera regime in Chile against the people. That, of course, provoked the mass movement last year. But now what have we seen? As all these attacks have intensified, we've seen the masses flooding back to the streets. General strike in Bolivia, forcing a general election which took place, and the sweeping back to power with a landslide majority, bigger than Morales' original vote, for the mass Morales party. We've seen the revolts that Hannah mentioned. Guatemala, mass protests, the burning down of the Congress building or its satellite, forcing the government to drop its austerity packages. Peru, 3 presidents brought down in a week as a result of mass protests taking place there. Protests kicking off again in Chile, and we should underline the point here. What is taking place in Chile at the present time? You had that massive revolutionary upsurge in 2019, centering the demand eventually for a constituent assembly and for the abandonment and the ending of the Pinochet dictatorship's era of constitution. Every main political party of the bourgeois in Chile opposed any change to the constitution. And right up to the end of that movement, they were absolutely implacable. No change to the constitution itself. And yet, as a consequence of the mobilization of millions, they were obliged to call a plebiscite on whether people wanted to change the constitution or not. And that voted 80% against Pinochet's constitution and demanded a change. Now, what the Chilean government's doing now is trying to manipulate a fraud in terms of the actual change that took place, but none of that would have happened without the mass movement that has taken place. So we're seeing a resurgence of the movement taking place throughout the continent. And very instructively, on the heels of Trump's defeat in the US, Bolsonaro in Brazil, this giant of a movement. First of all, you saw the mass protests take place against the killing of a young black. And by the way, the brutal killings of the black population in Brazil puts into the shade the scale of the killings in the United States. It's a genocide. It's thousands every year are executed by the paramilitary police, Policia Militar as they call it, and it's absolutely brutal. And Bolsonaro has gone into this election. He's had Trump's policy in terms of denial of the virus, pandered to a populist position, appeared to increase his support by giving out food baskets to the poorest section of the population. And yet, what happened? The recent local elections, Bolsonaro was slaughtered in the election in the elections, and it underlines the limits of reaction. It's extremely illuminating for what can take place in the next period. Because not only was Bolsonaro slaughtered in the Brazilian elections, the PT, the Workers' Party, which has swung to the right, done a Keir Starmer on Brazilian terms, and that lost dramatic ground in the election as well. And who gained? It was partly the old traditional so-called centre-right parties of the capitalist class, but most significantly PSOL, the Socialist Left Party in Brazil, made historic breakthroughs. They become a mass force in the crucial city of Rio. They went into the second round in Sao Paulo for the first time ever, the mass populist state there, and it's put PSOL back in the national map in terms of the national political debate as representing a new, or possibly new, rebirth of the Brazilian left, at least having taken an important step forward from these elections. And that poses important issues. It poses the issue of what the left does when they come into power, when they messed it up throughout the continent and threw the position away and let the right come back into power. But even where that happens, that's not the end of the story, because the masses again can take up the continent struggle because capitalism finds no way out. And we're back to the position now of what is the real alternative. And this is the crucial question which we've seen erupt in mass movements around the world. You can have these mass movements develop. You can have even new parties develop and come into power. But unless they have the program that enables them to break with capitalism, then it will be a almost endless cycle of stumbling from one crisis to another, and it will pose the threat of the right preparing to come back into power. And we should, by the way, also add, because they've tried to use the issue of Venezuela. They did it in the US presidential elections. They did it a little bit here as well in the general election. They've tried to use it as a club to beat the left about the idea of socialism. Venezuela is a disaster, they say. And by the way, it is a disaster now. There's been a horrific social and economic collapse. 5 million Venezuelans have fled the country because of the economic position. It's an absolutely catastrophic situation. And the right wing in Venezuela have struggled for years to overthrow Chavez firstly, and then his successor Maduro. And Maduro is presiding over an economic catastrophe, a social catastrophe, a regime that's riddled with corruption. All of that is true, and yet people still were not prepared to go to the right. And we can see here the price that imperialism has paid by having Donald Trump as the US presidency. Because one of the factors which has saved Maduro's regime was Trump's intervention in Venezuela, where he threatened military intervention to overthrow the regime, and it's probably been a key factor which has firmed up support on the basis, well, we're not happy with this, but we don't want that in terms of US troops stomping through the streets of Caracas, which is never, by the way, a really serious option, because had they done that, the whole of Latin America would have erupted in flames against US imperialist intervention. So there's very many lessons here that arise from this, but the crucial lesson out of it is the critical need for organization and parties that can have a program, a strategy for struggle, and a program that is capable of breaking with capitalism. The elections in Brazil give a big opportunity to PSOL. It represents an important breakthrough, but now it's going to put PSOL to the test. What's it going to do with the support that it has and potentially could get even on a stronger basis in terms of its programme to really sink roots amongst the working class and establish a real programme to transform society. But it's going to be a massive struggle, which is just beginning. 2021, internationally, I think it is true, but in Latin America, it is going to be staggering from one convulsion and mass movement to another because of the situation which is opened up. And that, again, is going to put these new lefts which have emerged and have come back to power in the case of Bolivia, is going to put them to the test as well. What can they do? And it's during that process we hope the bigger sections of the working class, the masses and the poor, with the assistance hopefully of the CWI, can intervene to assist them to draw the lessons of what programme is necessary to break with capitalism and eliminate the threat of the right to bouncing back indefinitely. So there's very many lessons there which are posed for Europe and indeed elsewhere in the world situation which is opening up.
Thanks, Tony. That's a crucial point. Such a potential exists in Latin America, and in this particular situation where these kind of revolt taking place, and we face with the historical crisis for capitalism, at this worst crisis at least since 1930s, like we discussed. But then we see a weakest response from the so-called left. That's the question everybody asks: where is the left at the moment? What the left is doing, why it is so weak. But also absolute need, like Tony pointed out, is to build a combative new workers' party with a far-sighted perspective and clear leadership. How that can be built is a crucial question for next year and the coming years. I would like to see Hannah pointed out some kind of how can this happen. Hannah, can you give us some ideas?
Okay, I mean, first of all, just to go back a bit in history, only briefly, but this has been a crucial issue through really more than one epoch now, you could say, in a way. Because if you go back to the collapse of the Stalinist regimes in Russia and Eastern Europe, which were not in any way genuine socialism, were brutal dictatorships, but were based on a form of a planned economy, at the time that they collapsed, there was an era of capitalist triumphalism. Ours is the only possible system. And you saw the mass workers' parties, which were always had leaderships who in the end defended the capitalist system. We're not suggesting they were models, but the mass workers' parties that did exist, they either collapsed or became really unalloyed capitalist neoliberal parties at that point in time, summed up by Blairism and New Labour in Britain. So Trotsky wrote in the Transitional Programme about how the crisis of humanity could be brought down to the crisis of the leadership of the working class. And the CWI said in that period, it's not just a crisis of leadership, it is also a crisis of organisation. But then after the 2007-2008 economic crisis, there were the first attempts by workers and young people in different countries to start to form new left formations, we called them, in different ways. Things like Syriza in Greece, Podemos, Corbynism, Bernie Sanders, a whole series of different new left formations that began to develop. Now, they were limited. Their programmes were limited in terms of what they stood for. Actually, even right-wing leaders of the social democratic parties in the 70s, in words at least, had programmes to the left of many of the programmes of those formations. They also had limited active participation by the working class. You couldn't really call them mass workers' parties, generally speaking. It was more radicalised and impoverished middle-class layers that dominated, and it's important to involve them, but we need parties where the working class is central. And generally, they also had very limited democracy, so limited ability for any of the ranks of those parties to voice their views. And those first attempts have generally been in office and betrayed, most clearly in the case of Syriza in Greece, or have been defeated in other ways. A year ago, Corbyn was leading Labour's general election campaign. He's now been kicked out of the Labour Party, had what's called the whip suspended, which means he's not sitting as a Labour MP by the new pro-capitalist right-wing leadership. So, like you said, the working class has gone into this devastating crisis in almost every country with nothing even approximating a mass political voice arguing their point of view. And unfortunately, that's not just on the political plane. You have to say that the majority of the trade union leaders, especially in the initial phases of the pandemic, capitulated globally to a mood of national unity, that we've got to stand together with our capitalist governments in order to fight the virus, as if the working class and the bosses ever had the same interests. So there is an urgent task now to fight to transform the trade unions, but also for the working class to fight for its own mass political voice, and for that to be democratic and have a clear socialist programme. And one of the features of this era can be kind of illusions in spontaneity. Maybe you don't need parties. After all, parties have always betrayed us. That's the idea. But you've only got to look at the fantastic movements that have taken place worldwide in Lebanon, Hong Kong, Nigeria, and see that while spontaneous movements can have a big effect, there are real limits, despite their potential power, to what they can win without organisation and without a party. So we have to solve the question of the right for the working class having its own party if it's to win decisive victories. Where will it come from exactly? It's going to vary from country to country. But a basic idea of Marxism is that the mass of the working class learn on the basis of their own experience, combined, of course, with the CWI and others putting the arguments, but central is their own experience. And we should recognise, we couldn't have predicted exactly where most of the old new formations were going to erupt from, but workers will have learnt some lessons from those formations. And as a new battle for political representation comes up, then the need for them to have a more thoroughgoing socialist programme that actually challenges and wants to overthrow the capitalist system, for them to be parties of the working class, workers will, in many cases, have learnt those lessons. Now, that doesn't mean that it's automatic that we're going to have stable new formations. They can still be very crisis-ridden, because if they have leaders who, in the end, act in the interests of the capitalist class, those parties actually can split and shatter quite quickly. But they will also offer big opportunities to win mass support for a Marxist programme for the ideas of the CWI. And the capitalist class really are terrified of that. The last economic crisis, they felt like the one thing that they had on their side is there was no development of mass parties actually fighting for socialism. And that meant they were able to preserve their system. But they're really worried that this time around it's going to be different. Not least, by the way, because of the scale of the state intervention that's taken place. The Financial Times had an editorial where they said, well, there's no choice but to carry out this massive state intervention, but it could bring socialism on its coattails. And that's their fear. Workers can see if the state can intervene like this to prop up the capitalist system, why can't we have a society where the state can spend money in order to provide decent public services, workers to have a decent wage, to be able to retire when they've still got a life to live, free education. But to get that requires getting rid of the capitalist system itself and the private ownership of the major corporations. And they're really frightened of that. And there's a real prospect of mass parties developing which move in that direction in the next period. And the CWI has a very important role in fighting for that to take place.
Thanks, Anna. The crucial question is to solve this question of the workers' representation, the working class party. And there is a lot of potential exists. We covered quite a lot of points today in brief format. However, you can read quite a lot in socialistworld.net. We have published various analyses this year. We will continue to publish more. And this is the last broadcast. Before we finish, I would like to kind of bring in Tony to talk about a little bit what prospect for capitalism and socialism in the year 2020 and going forward in 2021. Can you give us some details, Tony?
Well, I think, we have to look at it, as I say, that this year 2020 opened up a new era. And really, it's a question of what prospects lay before capitalism, before the working class, and both of them point to the crucial necessity of re-establishing the idea of socialism as an alternative form of society. I think if we go back to the beginning of this discussion we've had here today, Hannah made a very important point at the beginning. She singled out Jeff Bezos, this oligarch who's stalking the planet through his Amazon empire at this particular stage. But it highlights a very important point, because really Amazon and the grotesque wealth of Bezos really illustrate the nature of modern day capitalism. I mean, you have never had, and this is going to be a feature which I think in 2021 and probably beyond is going to dominate the consciousness of millions of people around the world, the rage which is felt between the disparity between the rich and the poor, because it is unprecedented in the history of capitalism. Hannah gave one figure in terms of Bezos' wealth. We'll break down what that means. According to one of the reports that I read, it means that he is earning $150,000 every single minute. I mean, it is mind blowing. I mean, what the hell he spends it on it's impossible to imagine what you spend that amount of money on, or maybe not in some cases. But nevertheless, it's staggering. And this is the nature of modern day capitalism. Even before the onset of this pandemic in 2017, the not 80, not 800, the 8 richest people on the planet had the same income and wealth of the poorest 50% of the whole of the total inhabitants of this planet. I mean, you cannot imagine a society that has reached this particular degree of inequality, and that is going to shape many of the struggles, the resentment which is there. And by the way, Hannah mentioned the vaccine quite correctly, the hope that it can give. Well, even how that is distributed, there's going to be vast inequalities in terms of that. Firstly, in the advanced capitalist countries, it's not straightforward how it's going to be fully distributed, but it's also the case that in whole swathes of the neo-colonial world, they're not going to get access to the vaccine for years to come, if ever, in terms of the position that is there. 90% of the population in the world's poorest countries have no access, to the governments have bought nothing for the vaccine at this particular stage, and that is going to underline the whole position. Now, that inequality, the monopolization which exists, has never reached this degree in the history of capitalism itself, and it's a crucial issue in terms of the nature of the next decade and the struggles that will emerge from it. Now, what's going to take place from capitalism in this period? You've had the stimulus packages, as Hannah and other comrades have commented on, that we have analysed, and there may be more stimulus packages, particularly in the advanced capitalist countries, because of the depth of the recession. They would do anything to try and prop up and save the system. But what is striking is that despite the unprecedented scale of the stimulus packages, they've not averted the worst economic recession since the 1930s. And that really is a hallmark. Now, there's bound to be some sort of economic kickback. There's going to be a certain period of recovery, at least in some of the capitalist economies. That is bound to take place, and it's better that takes place. But what's it going to mean? What's the type of recovery? We've had recoveries before, which have also been accompanied by the existence of mass unemployment, by a driving down of wages and increased exploitation of the working class, and recoveries that you're going to see in the course of the next decade are going to be short-lived, they're going to be ephemeral, and they're going to be shallow. And it means that the system is going to stagger from one crisis to the next. It's in a dead end, this society. The tragedy is you have the position where humankind has made phenomenal advances on science and technique in the course of the past period. In a certain sense, it's even reflected in the vaccine. The fact they developed a vaccine, which appears to work, we'll see, in less than a year. Nevertheless, that's an incredible achievement, reflecting the scientific advances which have been made. You've had other leaps forward which have taken place. They now have a test where they think they can diagnose cancer and other diseases much, much earlier, which means it's prevention. as you could have. You have scientific developments on the computer front of quantum computers being developed in China and elsewhere. I mean, it's phenomenal what has been done. Even the Chinese, what they've done recently in the last few days with this mission to the moon and bringing it back, it's far more complicated what they've done and more developed than what was done 40 years ago when the Americans and the Russians went to the moon. And they're doing it for their own particular reasons. But the tragedy is you have this gross inequality, this scientific advance which has taken place in society, and capitalism is imprisoned as a dead-end system. It's incapable of applying these developments on a generalized basis towards resolving the problems facing humankind at this point in time. And added to that has to be the environmental crisis which is taking place. So we are going into a decade of storm, of stress, of unprecedented upheaval. We've seen struggles, mass struggles, millions moving towards wanting to fight against this system and wanting to fight for an alternative system. The key question is, though, is if the working class globally is going to be in a position to rebuild in the course of the next years during this crisis, new organizations, mass parties of the working class, combative fighting trade unions, and if we're able to build mass Marxist parties eventually, that will be able to take the necessary steps to break with capitalism and establish a new system. There's nothing guaranteed in history or in society, but the opportunity and the necessity for the building of mass socialist forces in the course of the 2020s is going to be posed, not only as a want and as a desire, but as a crucial necessity from the point of view of looking forward to solving all of the problems that face humankind at this particular point in time. And if this crisis has demonstrated one thing above anything else, it is the fact that if we're going to do that, it has to be done on a global level. Might not start uniformly in one country, but the objective has to be to manage this environmental catastrophe, to manage the economic situation. We need a genuine democratic socialist plan of production being established on a global basis, because it's only through that we'll be able to apply the science and technique which has been developed by humankind on a generalized basis for the benefit of all humankind. And that's the future we have to look forward to. But I would just conclude on behalf of the CWI for this year, emphasizing one point. That is not going to happen automatically. No ruling class in history has ever given up its power, its rule, without a struggle. And as Engels put it, and that means with no holds barred. They do anything to protect their system, and it means consciously building an alternative. It's going to be a battle. We have the Christmas break, at least in the West and other countries, so we have to prepare for that, enjoy it as much as you can in the course of this lockdown or restrictions that are imposed. But the crucial question we have to look for is what's coming in 2021. And it's going to be a bruising year, a year of battle and struggle as far as millions around the world are concerned. And the CWI has to be present, participating, intervening in those struggles with a program, taking initiatives for action where necessary to advance the struggles as part of the framework to build a stronger CWI, and ultimately as part of the objective of building a mass socialist alternative, which is now crucial for the development of humankind at the end of the next decade.
Thanks, Tony. Thanks, Tony and Hannah, for giving us a brief summary of what has taken place, what needs to be done, etc. And we have to end this grotesque capitalism, and the CWI will be working in the next year and the years to come exactly that. And then we need all the help that we can get from you. Like Tony mentioned earlier, it is a crucial work that we need to build our own forces. Unless we do that, we cannot bring about changes. And so as part of that, don't be passive, get involved, read our material on socialistworld.net, but also support us by donating. You can go into socialistworld.net and click on the donate button and donate towards the work that we are doing, but also support us in the social media, like our Facebook page, Socialist World CWI, and the Twitter, and also subscribe to the YouTube CWI Media. And seasonal greetings to all been supporting us all this year, and then we want your support next year, more support next year, and then spread the word, and then get in touch with us, have a rest, and prepare for a big battle to come in the coming years. Thank you.